Hey guys, how's it going? My name is Gilligan, and today I wanted to talk about electric car design, specifically pre-Tesla EVs, just to see how far we've come in terms of making an electric vehicle accessible to the mass market, and to see all the strange ideas and aesthetics they've come up with over the years. So let's get right into it. This is going to be a comprehensive list of every notable or strange EV from 1881 to 2003. Let's go. We start our journey in 1881, and to give some context for the time that we're in, since it was an entirely different world than the one that me or you know, I wanted to lay out some bullet points. So, horses were still the dominant form of transportation worldwide, and everything was built for horses. You know, the carriages, the streets, everything was built with horses in mind as the primary mode of transportation. The streets were littered with horse crap. Literally horses crapping all over the place. You know, there was no way to stop that. Everything smelled bad. And most people had never seen a self-propelled vehicle before besides like a train or a boat at this time. And those were the only forms of long-distance travel. The only other way was going by horse. So the first practical internal combustion engine car was developed by Carl Benz in 1885. It was called the motor wagon. Electricity was spreading throughout the cities as well, and electric motors and batteries were well understood and being experimented with all the time. You know, with things like street lights, trolleys, and then the just early home electrification. So this is the scene we are in 1881 when a man named Gustave built the first electrically propelled vehicle in France. If you notice the date, this is 4 years before Carl Benz made the motor wagon, so the electric car was actually there before the ICE car, surprisingly. Even though ICE engines were invented before this, it's still pretty impressive that the first viable automobile was an electric car. And when I say car, I'm being a little generous because this thing was more like a tricycle with a battery attached to it. Either way, this was extremely impressive for its time and ended up being debuted on the streets of Paris to an amazed crowd. Like I said, up to this point, self-propelled vehicles were a rare sight, so it must have been pretty strange to see this bike just going by itself with the passenger on top. Apparently, the police actually ended up banning this on certain streets because they didn't know how to classify a vehicle that didn't have a horse. The tricycle used was the Starley Coventry lever tricycle, and its design is very strange for what we see nowadays when it comes to tricycles. It had one big wheel on the left side with two smaller ones on the right side. The batteries used were lead acid batteries, and they were attached to the back, as you can see here. Here's the lever you used to steer this thing. Yeah, this was definitely the early experimental stages of vehicle design. Definitely check this video out too if you get a chance. It's someone driving a recreation of this thing in 2021, and it's quite a sight to see. All in all, this contraption was purely experimental, and Gustave never went further with it. For some reason, his curiosity ended up moving on to marine propulsion systems, leaving the advancement of this concept to future men. Our story picks back up in 1888 with the Electro wagon built by Andreas Flocken in Germany. This car is widely credited as the first true four-wheeled electric vehicle built from the ground up and not just retrofitted carriages and stuff like that. As you can see, it still has the carriage type silhouette because we're in the transition period from carriages to automobiles, but the mechanics of it were getting closer to a car with no design incorporated for being horse-drawn in any way. This car also used lead acid batteries just like the last car that we saw. There were other batteries around in this era like the zinc carbon cells, but these weren't rechargeable, so it wasn't really useful on the vehicles. The lead acid battery was the only practical choice for vehicles at this time, and we're going to see that time and time again. The weight is a major issue since obviously they're made out of lead, so it's freaking heavy. The estimated top speed of this vehicle was 9 miles per hour and a range of 15 miles, so nothing insane, but it's definitely an upgrade from the last one that we saw with 8 miles per hour speed and then 12-mile range. There isn't any record of how many of these were made, but it couldn't have been more than a handful, and the prototype might have been the only one that was ever made, to be honest. The electric wagon by William Morrison was made in the USA in 1890 and was a pretty big leap from the previous cars we've discussed. This one had a 14 mile per hour top speed and a 50-mile range. They achieved this by packing in more batteries, making the frame wood so that it was more lightweight, and making the top speed not too high so that it doesn't burn out the batteries. The batteries alone still ended up weighing around 800 pounds, illustrating the important ratio between weight and power when it comes to these cars. The energy density is critical when it comes to these. The lead acid batteries have 25 to 30 watt hours per kilogram, and for comparison, today's Teslas have about 250 to 300 watt hours per kilogram, a 10 times improvement. For reference, the Benz motor wagon in 1885 had a top speed of 7 miles per hour and a range of 18 miles, and a weight of about 600. The Morrison weighed around 2,300 pounds, which is almost 4 times that weight. Another huge thing with this car was its ability to fit 6 people in it. I can't imagine what this thing would have weighed with 6 people in it, but I guess maybe people were smaller or something back in the day, I don't know. This car was displayed at public events and exhibitions and ended up attracting attention for its passenger size and specs. That meant that it could be used reliably in real-world conditions. It played a major role in inspiring the EV wave that we'll discuss later in the early 1900s. Even though this was a great electric car and seemed to have all the stats that you need to, sell something like this, it still never went into production and only remained as a demonstration. We'll see on this retrospective that, it's pretty easy to make like a model car, just a concept, but it's a whole nother thing to actually like mass produce it, and that's really what's necessary for EVs to actually like gain a foothold in the market. A super obscure fact in US history is that the first police vehicle was actually an EV in Akron, Ohio. This thing was capable of carrying a full squad of police with some prisoners also. It had a top speed of around 18 miles per hour with a range of 30 miles before you'd have to bring it back to the depot and charge it. One funny thing I found while researching this is that they actually used to use bronze bells in the police cars as a form of siren, to like, obviously tell people that they're coming through. And I was just thinking, just imagine like speeding in the 1800s, which would have been like 25 miles per hour, if even that. And you just start hearing gongs behind you and the police are pulling up and, in their prehistoric EV or like horse-drawn carriage or whatever. This vehicle actually ended up going through some turbulent times because in 1900 there was actually a freaking full-on riot apparently, and the vehicle got thrown into the Erie Canal. Thankfully it ended up being fished out and served another 5 years until it was sold for scrap. Rest in peace. This one has a really insane design. It kind of looks like a battering ram or something, and you can see we finally kind of passed the carriage design into something completely new. The reason it looks like this is because it was actually a racer, and it was designed specifically with aerodynamics in mind, something that will be a crucial component in EVs of the future. Like I said, this was specifically designed as a racer, so it didn't have any, range considerations in mind or cargo capacity, stuff like that. It held the speed record over all gas cars at the time, proving that the EV could outpace ICE vehicles, even if it was just for a few exciting miles. The record that was set was 56 miles per hour, and not even a year later, the next car on our list actually ended up beating that. The winner of the speed trials of the late 1800s was La James Contente, which was also the first car to break 60 miles per hour, setting a record at the time of 65.8 miles per hour. It only held this record for around 4 years though, because by 1903, gas cars were regularly hitting 70 miles per hour. It literally shows how quick all this is happening. This vehicle has an even more aerodynamic design than the last one and literally looks like a rocket designed to pierce through the air. The name translates to never satisfied, which is fitting because this thing broke the record right after the last one broke the record. It's crazy because seatbelts weren't invented at this time, so the guy who's riding this thing is completely exposed and just at the mercy of God, and if this thing crashes, God forbid. What a time. The loaner Porsche Semper Vivis is our next car on the list. Wow, what a name. And this was Porsche, and this was actually 31 years before he would actually create the Porsche that we know today. The Semper Vivis translates to always alive, which is, referencing the electronic system. This car actually has the honor of being the first hybrid vehicle, technically, not really in the way that we think of it now. Instead of switching the drive from electric to gas, it actually had a generator inside that the gas would be poured into, and it would create electricity that would then go into the battery. Another interesting thing about this vehicle is that it actually had hub motors, which means that there was a motor inside of every one of the wheels that was powering it. The top speed was 22 miles per hour, which isn't half bad, and the range was around 30 to 50 miles. But if you use that little gas generator hybrid thing, it could theoretically get to 100 miles of range. And as you can see, we're getting closer to the car kind of form factor, and this thing's kind of like 50% carriage, 50% car, and I honestly think it looks sick. It's super interesting. The next one is really special because it's the first EV maker to actually enter production and make a non-trivial amount of cars. It's the Baker Electric, which was made in Cleveland, Ohio. They sold these cars to urban wealthy buyers for about $1,800 to $3,000, which is about $60 to $100K today. Even though there isn't any official records of how many of these were made, modern estimates put it at around 3,000 to 5,000 cars in their time from 1899 to 1914, and they were definitely producing the most electric cars in the world around this time. The car had a top speed of 20 miles per hour with a range of 50 miles. This is with its base lead-acid batteries though, and it actually jumped to 80 to 100 miles of range with an Edison nickel iron battery option. It was expensive, but it definitely improved the range. This vehicle was actually able to break through the market for a couple reasons. One is that they targeted the right audience with the wealthy urban buyers because no matter what, this thing was going to be expensive. This is similar to what Tesla would do around 100 years later, starting with the top of the market and then kind of making your way down, because it's just no way you're going to make the new technology cheap in the beginning. Two is that they actually developed this with it being a product in mind, using modular bodies, reused chassis, and standardized battery packs. The EVs before this were all just kind of experiments and never really tried for the actual production. The gas cars at the time were even more smelly and noisy than they are today, and you actually needed to crank a whole hand crank to start the car, and sometimes that could actually backfire and, throw you, freaking back all hard, break your arm or something. So the value proposition of an electric car that just started right away and didn't have any of these issues was very compelling at the time. Thomas Edison actually even owned one of these at the time, as well as Alexander Graham Bell, who made the telephone. This product also proved specifically popular with women because of the easy start and no toxic fumes. The Detroit Electric was also able to break through the EV market, or maybe more like co-invent it with the Baker Electric. It was built by the Anderson Electric Car Company in Detroit, Michigan, 1907, and they managed to stay in business 32 years, which is honestly a freaking record for this era. During this time, they managed to make around 13,000 cars, blowing Baker Electric out of the water with their 5,000 cars. This had similar stats to the Baker, with a top speed of around 25 miles per hour and a range of 80 to 100 miles. The bigger range was achieved with a combination of things like tire and drivetrain efficiencies and a lower cruising speed of around 15 to 18 miles per hour. The price was also comparable to the Baker, with a $2,650 retail price, which would be around $80K today. This means they targeted the professional and wealthy buyers just like Baker did, and they branded this as a luxury vehicle. The interior was also really important to the whole experience, with things like plush upholstery, curtains, and more. It was supposed to give it like a moving parlor kind of effect. The passengers also sat pretty high with big glass windows to see out of. This wasn't just for the experience though, even though it definitely added to that. It's also because the battery was on the floor, so they had to be raised a little bit. So this era is considered the golden age of EVs, and after this, we will enter a dark age. There are many things that caused the ICE cars to be dominant, but one of the main ones was the battery tech was just not improving quick enough for a rapidly industrializing world. One interesting piece of data from around this time in 1900 was a census that basically shows the percentages of cars that are on the road. And you could see it was almost anyone's guess at this time what would end up being the dominant form of energy. They were all pretty much neck and neck, and gas cars were even the lowest at 22%. In New York, the ratio was actually 50% because they already had the DC charging infrastructure that was needed to charge these things. Going into the 1930s, the electric vehicle ended up losing the early energy wars, with gasoline becoming the main way to get around. The electric starters for gas cars were a major innovation and made it so that you could just go in and start the engine without having to do the hand crank and all that. Gas also became abundant after major discoveries in the US and other places in the world. And the infrastructure scaled quickly, with gas stations being pretty much all over the place by the 30s. And lastly, cities began to sprawl out, with suburbia being born, and people needed to go longer distance to get where they needed to go. This made short-range EVs, which is all that was possible at the time, a hard sell. As we'll see in this era, the EV didn't completely die out, but it got reassigned to roles that were good for its short range and quiet operation. They all ended up becoming non-flashy utility vehicles for the most part, instead of a grand promise of an electric future. One of the most successful niches the electric vehicle found itself in at this time was actually the milk float, which was mostly in the UK. That's a funny fact that I always forget about, is that there used to be a milkman delivering milk to everybody. Apparently the fridge becoming commonplace was one of the main factors in resigning the milkman to the history books, but back to the milk float. Like I said, this was the perfect niche for an EV to find itself in because of a couple things. The quietness was perfect for early morning deliveries, as well as the slow speeds made it so that the milk would make it to its journey without falling and cracking all over the place. The constant starting and stopping would actually have been a good thing too for the batteries of the EV, because they don't do so good with the long range, they need some time to recover before going again. Milk delivery and EVs ended up being such a perfect match that the only thing that ended up killing this setup was actually just the invention of fridges that I mentioned earlier, which ended up making the whole thing, not worth it. So in the end, the system ended up going on for about 20 years between the 30s and 50s, which is pretty impressive for an EV. This strange, flimsy looking car with one headlight is actually a special curiosity, because it was actually made during Nazi-occupied France around 1941. The Peugeot VLV was made specifically because of the scarcity of fuel and other materials during the war. Made with a lightweight aluminum body and a narrow two-seat layout, this thing was made to give the people of France the most basic of mobility. And in the end, only people with special permits were able to even buy one. The vehicle wasn't ordered or directed by the German military, but was instead made by Peugeot for civilian use in the scarce material climate that they found themselves in. The Peugeot factories were actually occupied by German troops at the time, and they were forced to make tank parts and airplane engines, while they had to sneak the making of the VLV. Once the Germans ended up realizing that precious lead and copper were being used in the creation of this, they banned its production, and only 377 ever ended up being made. The East German electric vans call back to the utility categorization that EVs found themselves in at this time, being used for mail delivery in Soviet-controlled East Germany in the 1950s. EVs ended up being a perfect vehicle type for Soviet-controlled East Germany because of the general shortage of oil and because of how reliable electricity is when it comes to a planned economy. With gas, the supply can vary drastically, and you can end up having crises if the flow stops for any reason, even in a capitalist country. So, for the Soviets, they felt like they could depend on their energy needs better if they used coal-based electricity. Hence, electric postal vans. These vans were completely industrial and utilitarian. They were also modular, which allowed them to be repaired endlessly, which was definitely the case in poor East Germany. After visiting Nazi-controlled France and Soviet-controlled East Germany, we find ourselves back in the USA with the Henny Kilowatt from 1959. Yeah, I didn't even realize until making this that the electric cars had such a ride throughout history. It's quite amazing. This attempt at an EV is noteworthy because it wasn't made specifically for the delivery industry or because of a gas shortage. It was actually an honest attempt at a consumer car. Even though it attempted to break through the market and had some things going for it, it ended up not really being able to do too much, with only 47 cars actually being made at the end. To give some context to the time that we're in, this is before like the whole interstate highway system would be completed, but there was still a lot of highways like Route 66 crisscrossing the US, allowing people to take road trips and go farther than they ever had before. And with a range of 40 to 60 miles and no national charging infrastructure, people felt uneasy about the limitations that they would run into if they had this EV. The price was also really high at about $3,600 to $5,000, which would be around $36,000 in today's money. This put it at around double of what a gas car would have been at the time, with this having less options and more limitations. This car was based on the Renault Dauphine and looked pretty much like every other car on the road, which is a crucial thing that companies would realize later on mattered a lot when it comes to selling EVs. Specifically, Tesla understood that desirability and aesthetics mattered a lot when it comes to selling these EVs and getting people to ditch their old ICE cars. Because if people didn't feel like they absolutely needed the product, they would probably just default to what they already knew, which was the gas cars. This vehicle quietly asked to be integrated into the transportation system, but what it needed to do was come in with a bang. The launch was also disastrous, with the first model having 36-volt lead-acid batteries, which capped the speed to around 35 miles per hour. They released a second version later, which doubled the volts to 72 and allowed it to get to 60 miles per hour, but by that time it was already too late. Being actually capable of getting to 60 miles per hour means that this is the first car that we have a 0 to 60 time for, and it was around 15 to 20 seconds. Remarkable. By the mid-century, the electric vehicle had been extinguished from the spotlight and was relegated to mostly just appliances like the delivery vans and milk floats. The highways, cheap gasoline, and the freedom of the open roads ended up enabling ICE cars to take center stage as the world's #1 form of transportation. Fortunately though, our next era brings back great excitement when it comes to EVs with the coming space age and experimental ways of thinking. I wasn't kidding when I said space age. Just look at this thing, it's literally a spaceship. And it's probably my favorite so far. I would honestly love to have a modern version of this thing. Developed by American Motor Corporation with the help of Galton Industries, the Amatron was only ever a concept car, but it was extremely unique for its time, with air-filled cushions as seats to reduce weight, and instead of a typical doors, it actually had a clamshell type thing where the top would open up for you to get in. This vehicle was also extremely small, with a length of about 7 feet and a height of just under 4 feet. It theoretically could fit 3 people side by side, but who knows how comfortable that would end up being. The battery setup was also interesting, with 2 different types inside. One being nickel cadmium, which is supposed to give extra power during acceleration, and the other being lithium nickel fluoride batteries, which were supposed to give it a steady cruising range. They also included regenerative braking in this whole package. And even though they weren't the first to do it, they were the first to advertise it as a key feature, and this would end up becoming a staple with EVs of the future. AMC claimed that the Amatron had a range of 150 miles and a top speed of 50 miles per hour. These are definitely the most ambitious numbers we've seen so far. 150-mile range is pretty much at the point where range anxiety is a thing of the past, but there's still the problem of a whole charging network. For reference, the modern Teslas have a range of about 300 miles, so we're pretty much halfway there with this one. 10 years later, they actually unveiled this car again as the Electron, but it was pretty much the exact same thing, and it was just for PR. All it had was a different paint job and some minor aesthetic tweaks. One of the original models was actually found in a barn in Michigan, pretty much completely intact, which is super awesome. I hope they refurbish it and get it running again. Continuing with the tiny concept EVs, we have the Ford Commuta. Yeah, you know this thing be commuting and shit. You'll see another micro EV in this era, and that's because the range and speed that was possible at this time made it so that the only realistic niche that these things could fit into was as a little tiny micro car for the city. Just zipping around from stop to stop and parking anywhere they could fit their tiny frame into. These weren't even supposed to be on the highway. You can kind of think of them just as like golf carts basically. The speed cars go now make it so that this thing wouldn't even be allowed on normal roads in today's time. But yeah, these cars were even smaller than a modern micro car, and you could even fit 3 of them into 1 parking space. You could put 2 adults in the front and 2 children in the back, but you just have to pray to God that you don't get in an accident with a tiny car filled with 4 people. I can't imagine what the aftermath of something like that would be. The car was also mostly made of plastic, so yeah. Lead acid batteries were used in the Commuta, and it ended up allowing for a top speed of 40 miles per hour and a pitiful range of 40 miles. So you can see why it's never made it out of the prototype stage. Props to Chevrolet for actually attempting a full-size car with this one, but there was a reason that the others went for a more micro car. The results were all the same though, with this never making it out of the experimental stage. If you're wondering where the Electro Ev1 is, it was made as an experiment in 1966. It wasn't too different from the second one except for having lead acid batteries and a DC motor. The Electro Ev2 came with a top speed of 80 miles per hour and a range of around 70 miles. You'd think they had finally gotten to the point where they could enter this into the market as an actual serious competitor to ICE cars, but once you look at the battery details, it all starts to make sense. They used a silver zinc battery pack pack for this one instead of the lead acid batteries that was typical of all these cars, but they came at a rough price of $35,000 in 1966, which would have been around $345,000 today. And this was just for the battery, let alone the rest of the vehicle. So yeah, not even close to something you could actually sell and make a reasonable profit on. And to top that off, the batteries would only last around 100 charges, so pretty much useless. But yeah, besides that, there isn't too much interesting about this car. It's basically just a Chevy Corvair Monza with an electric battery and a drivetrain instead of an engine, but at least they tried. Wow, just look at this monstrosity of a vehicle. It looks like something Gru or the Minions would ride, and I honestly love it. Also definitely giving me some heavy Fallout vibes. But yeah, the Urbania was a tiny Italian city car concept that, believe it or not, had a rotating cabin almost like a turret. One of the perks of this system is that you never had to go into reverse. You could just turn the whole cabin around and, you go forward. I never thought I would want something like that, but I guess. The other perk is that if you were in a tight space with cars on either side of you, you could just rotate the cabin right to the sidewalk and jump on out. I can honestly see where they're coming from with that one. I mean, I've definitely been in that position where you're so close to the car next to you that you have to just hold the door open just enough so you can get out, but hold it for dear life so that it doesn't let go and hit the car. But making the entire cabin 360 degrees rotatable is probably like kind of overkill for something you only run into once in a while. But not having to go in reverse might be something insane I never knew I needed. Eventually the turret was converted to a normal cabin in later iterations. The range was about 55 miles with a top speed of 31 miles per hour. And I guess they were going to do like a whole modular thing with the bodies, making different styles for different needs. Like a wicker style cabin, which would have looked like a giant picnic basket. And a Berlinetta version, which would have been a more enclosed plastic shell. Unfortunately, I can't find really any images of these, and general information about this vehicle is pretty scarce because it's probably the most obscure thing on this whole list. The Wit car was an EV in Amsterdam that was specifically designed to be part of a rental service where people would pay a small annual fee and be able to use any of the cars in the system. These would be available at a number of different stations throughout the city. You would also have to pay per kilometer or minute driven, but it seemed to be really economical as thousands of people signed up to be part of the program. They even had magnetic keys to start the car, as well as a central computer called the PDP-11, keeping track of all the memberships and assigning cars where they needed to be. You can see how ahead of its time this system was, and something similar nowadays would be those electric scooters that you can just pick up, go, and then drop it off wherever for the next person to use. This whole project was started by Lud Schimmelpenninck, who was an industrial designer as well as a social innovator and activist. He was honestly a visionary from what I can tell, and he was an influential member of the Provo movement, which believed in anarchist and anti-authoritarian ideals. They didn't believe in violence, but saw provocation as the way to change things, doing different public acts to expose the absurdity of government, policing, and other ideas. Before the Wit car, they had what they called the White Bicycle Plan, where they had painted hundreds of bicycles white and put them outside for anyone to use. The police ended up confiscating them all immediately, proving how dumb authority can be. The evolution of this idea was the Wit car we've been discussing, and it actually, Wit car like as in white car pretty much. Another thing that Lud and his movement were concerned with was the rising car culture and the way cars were overtaking cities, making them noisy, smelly, and dangerous. This is all incredibly interesting because if you've ever been to Europe, not everywhere but in specific places, they didn't let the cars take over and change the way all the infrastructure was designed. Like what you see in the US, where it's basically essential to have a car at this point if you want to get anywhere. Unfortunately, even though this was all pretty forward thinking with an electric car sharing system, the idea ended up failing because of a lack of continued government support, and the way traffic flows meant that all the cars would end up in the city center by the end of the day, making it unavailable for a lot of people. They did have 5 stations and 35 vehicles in use at its peak, so at least it didn't stay a prototype like most of the cars in this era. Well, would you look at that, another micro EV. I guess this really was the most viable form factor for an EV at this point, when you take into account that pretty much all these are using lead acid batteries, which make things unreasonable heavy once you get into full car size territory. The Scamp was actually made by Scottish Aviation, which, as the name suggests, made airplanes, not cars. But the reason for them taking a shot at an EV at this time in history is because at the time, there was a shrinking demand for aircraft programs and the government was pushing aerospace firms to move more into civilian technology. It is interesting though, because you can see some specific characteristics for this car that are telling of the aerospace design mindset. It has a super light fiberglass body and a minimal interior, focusing more on efficiency over comfort. Oh yeah, and even though the Scamp sounds like a perfect name for this vehicle, it's actually an acronym which means Scottish Commuter and Miniature Prototype. The specs were pretty rough on this thing though, with a top speed of 30 miles per hour and a range of 25 to 30 miles. It also only had enough room for one person, which, if we're being honest, the other microcars were probably in the same boat. So at least this one's honest about that. And check out those insanely small wheels. I guess it was for stability, but I can't imagine what the ride would have felt like in this thing. You'd probably have to watch out for pebbles like you're riding a skateboard or something like that. All in all though, this never ended up making it out of the prototype phase and forever remained a concept car. RIP. I honestly didn't know much about the lunar rover, aka moon buggy, before looking into this, and definitely didn't know it was an electric vehicle, but this thing literally had to be an EV because the explosions in the internal combustion engine wouldn't have worked on the moon since there's no atmosphere. Huh, the more you know. But yeah, we are truly entering the space age with this one, and the more I learned, the more I was amazed. For one, the whole vehicle program costed a whopping $38 million and produced 4 vehicles, so that's about 9.5 mil per buggy in 1971 dollars. And after the Apollo 15 mission where this thing debuted, it was actually left on the moon where it still resides to this day. The whole vehicle is foldable, which is how they were able to bring it with the limited space available. During the planning phases of the mission, they were actually designing the rover to be sent in on a second spacecraft. And some of the original designs were for a large portable lab type of vehicle that would have been pressurized inside and allowed the astronauts to do science experiments in there. They ended up going with the simpler, more manageable concept of having a small foldable buggy type of vehicle, but hopefully we end up seeing one of these portable labs sometime in the future because that would honestly be insane to see. The specs on this vehicle were also super unique, allowing it to overcome all the issues associated with space. It came with 2 silver zinc batteries, which if you remember were the same super expensive batteries that were used in the Electrovair 2 prototype. One of the problems with these batteries was the fact that they could only do about 100 charges before they were done, but that wouldn't really matter in this scenario because it was a one and done type of deal. The rover also had 4 motors in each wheel, which gave it a 4-wheel drive at all times. This was just in case one of the motors failed so the vehicle could still move. And move it did with a top speed of 8 to 10 miles per hour, but going downhill it could definitely exceed this. The wheels were made of a wire mesh because rubber wouldn't have survived the temperature swings on the moon, and each wheel had its own suspension designed to keep all the wheels intact with the uneven terrain. Apparently, one of the astronauts described the experience of riding this as being like driving a shopping cart downhill in low gravity. Now that sounds like a good time. One last interesting piece of trivia about this EV is the controls were actually oversized because the astronauts would be operating it in their huge spacesuits. I just thought that was kind of funny to imagine being in this oversized spacesuit and clicking all these oversized buttons on the moon buggy. And with that, we have left the space age and are entering an era where an oil crisis will leave engineers trying once again to ignite the electric dream. Will they win? No, it'll take another 30 years and a company named Tesla to finally do it, but let's see why that is anyway. Even though we've entered a new era, that doesn't mean the micro EVs are a thing of the past yet. And for proof of this, look no further than the Sebring Vanguard city car. And wow, did they go crazy with this design, looking like a whole ass doorstop on wheels. Apparently this looked like this for a lot of different reasons, but one of the main ones was just to cut costs because it's a lot simpler to do the flat panels than it is to do like curved ones. When you do a lot of curves in the panels, it requires custom tooling and thicker material for reinforcement. And would you believe me if I said that this was the best-selling EV before the Tesla Roadster? Now, that's not saying much when it comes to the EV category, but the company totaled out with about 4,400 units produced in its lifetime between this one and its successor, the commuter car. The number's pretty crazy when you think about it because most of the cars that we've seen have just been prototypes. The 1973 oil crisis really had people worried about fuel, and Sebring Vanguard took full advantage of it. But yeah, with a top speed of 30 to 38 miles per hour and a range of 30 to 40 miles, only under best case or ideal conditions, people quickly went back to their full size and full spec cars once the fuel anxiety went away. One terrifying detail about this vehicle though is the general safety features, of which there pretty much isn't any. The other micro EVs I mentioned also had critical safety problems, but the good thing about those is that they stayed prototypes and never ended up on the actual road. Being about a third of the size of an average car on the road and not having any airbags, you were pretty much YOLOing it every time you did your daily commute with this thing. Thank God that this wasn't capable of highway speeds or else you couldn't imagine. It did technically meet all the US regulations at the time, which is pretty astounding. After saying all that though, I'd honestly still want one of these in the modern day, even though the cars nowadays are freaking monsters compared to the ones back then. I'd risk it all just to drive this little cheese wedge, to be honest. The Tzero was yet another micro EV, but this time made in Italy by Zagato. If you don't know Zagato, they were a design house and coach builder founded in Milan. They worked primarily on luxury or sports cars. They were actually responsible for the Aston Martin DB4 GT, the Alfa Romeo TZ1 and 2, and many others. If you don't know how the manufacturing of cars worked back then, a company like Alfa Romeo would make the engine and chassis, while a design house like Zagato would make the body and sometimes the frame. But in the case of the Zagato Zell, which is the one we're talking about right now, they actually produced the whole thing, hoping to bank on the oil crisis just like the city car. But they did actually make it to production with this thing, and they totaled around 500 units in 2 years, which was way less than they initially planned. Besides that, there isn't too much to say about this one, other than the fact that it had a strange transmission with a 4-position speed selector and a 2-position foot pedal, giving 6 forward and 2 reverse gears. I can't imagine when you would want to use the second reverse gear. I guess if you wanted to do like a quick 3-point turn, but I imagine the times you need to do that with this tiny thing would be minimal. Wow, an actual full-sized EV and BMW to boot, what a breath of fresh air. The only thing that's a little disappointing is that the 1602E was just a modified 1602 model with the engine taken out and replaced by electric drivetrain and batteries. Either way, it's nice to see them actually try for a normal car, instead of these little city cars that never really work out in the long run. This car debuted at the Munich Olympics in 1972. Where they had 2 of them as support vehicles helping with carrying camera crews and some other tasks. They were also used as the lead vehicles on the track because they wouldn't be shooting out exhaust choking the runners. BMW wanted to show the cars of the future as well as do a practical experiment. And what better place than the Olympics in their home country. The top speed was actually not bad at 62 miles per hour, being one of the first EVs we've seen that could theoretically drive on the highway. The only major issue was the range at 18 to 37 miles, which basically kills any hype you'd have over the speed. The handling was also severely compromised due to the lead acid batteries, which weighed around 770 pounds. The major takeaway from this car and most of the cars that we've seen is the battery is truly the limiting factor. Lead acid batteries were the only practical choice at this time, and they were just too heavy to make any sense when you see what the weight ends up doing to the range and overall performance. So, unfortunately, this one never got any further than its debut at the Olympics, and the 2 units that were presented there are the only ones that were ever made. The good thing though is that they've actually been preserved. So, if you ever make it to the BMW Museum out in Germany, you might catch a glimpse of this piece of EV history. The Electruck from 1974. What a perfect name, tells you everything you need to know. But yeah, this beast was made by AM General, which was a division of AMC, the creators of the spacey Amatron we saw earlier. This time though, they didn't try to make something for the general public and instead went for a utilitarian vehicle designed for commercial drivers. Kind of similar to how we saw the milk float being a perfect approach for an EV all the way back in the 30s. Here we see delivery being tried again, but just in a more general sense with the Electruck. EVs are the obvious choice for this kind of work because of the predictable routes, which means that you can plan for the range that the vehicle has and then just go and charge them up at the station every night. The stop and go driving is also way better, like I was explaining before. Another reason is because gas cars, when they're idling, they end up wasting energy, and the stop-start cycles aren't good for the engines. The USPS bought 350 of these to use, and they remained in service through the late 70s and into the 80s. But they were gradually retired by around 1983 due to performance limitations and higher operating costs compared to gas cars. So yeah, another one bites the dust, primarily thanks to, you guessed it, battery energy density. One funny piece of trivia about this vehicle is that it was technically a hybrid. It had a small gas heater that was only used to defrost the windshields, because if the batteries were used, it would completely ruin the range. We've really come a long way. With a name like Enfield 8000, you'd think this might be some kind of rifle, at least that's where my mind goes. But nope, it's an electric vehicle designed in 1973 by Enfield Automotive. This one was definitely pushing closer to a micro EV than a full-size car, but it doesn't go as far as some of the vehicles we've seen like the city car. It was designed as a practical and efficient urban commuter. As you can see, there isn't any crazy design details or embellishes, just a straight and honest shot at an urban EV. The specs were definitely modest, even for EV standards, but generally well-rounded with a 40 mile per hour top speed and a 45 mile average range. The price was £2,800, which would have been around $41,600 today. Definitely steep when you consider that you could have gotten 2 mini 1000s at the time for the cost of one of these things. At the end, they got about 120 Enfields produced, of which 65 of them were purchased by the UK's Electricity Council and local electricity boards. Most of these were actually just used as meter reader vehicles. This puts it at 3rd place on the leaderboard for number of units produced, at least at this point in the timeline. So yeah, nothing too groundbreaking with the Enfield. The Chevy Electrovet was a concept car made using the Chevette as a base and was developed as a response to the oil crisis we've been discussing throughout this era. There isn't too much interesting data about this one, as it never even made it to a showroom or display, and definitely never got close to production. By the time they had finished it and concluded that an electric vehicle was not really viable as a consumer product yet, the worst of the oil crisis was gone, and they discarded the project and went with what worked, which was the ICE cars. This is yet another example of GM making a concept EV and then ditching it when they realized the tech wasn't there yet, instead of maybe putting the resources needed into developing battery tech and other crucial components needed to actually make it work. Now, I know that the resources needed would have been massive, but if anyone could have done it at this time, it was definitely GM. One last tidbit, the paint job decal that they did with this car was super 80s and I dig it. The Garrett Air Research Electric Vehicle was a research prototype developed by Garrett with the support of NASA and the Department of Energy. And that's air research as in aeronautics, not AI research, but it's kind of funny how that looks nowadays. This car was purely made to test the viability of EVs and to push forward the technology to something that could actually be practical. One of the specific innovations they applied to this vehicle was actually the flywheel hybrid assist. To explain this mechanism in simple terms, there's basically a heavy wheel that spins when the car has extra energy from cruising or slowing down. So as it's spinning, it's basically storing all that momentum, which is around 25,000 RPM, in a vacuum, which it then uses when the car needs extra power. This was the solution to the speed of the batteries, with the flywheel giving the car a quick energy burst. So yeah, quite an interesting approach to solving the speed problem. But this didn't end up being the breakthrough that they needed it to be, and nowadays flywheels are rarely used in EV design. But wait, can we talk about the aesthetics of this thing real quick? It's such a simple looking car, but the way the shapes and the color work together, it gives off such a futuristic industrial look. I immediately thought of the movie Gattaca. If you've ever seen that, I feel like it would fit perfectly in there. So yeah, this vehicle didn't move the mark too dramatically, but it does show that the government was putting incentives in place to further the technology of electric vehicles. And we did get an absolutely sick looking car from that. The Chrysler ETV1, short for Electric Test Vehicle, was another research prototype made in collaboration with General Electric, also funded by the Department of Energy, similar to the Garrett NASA car that we just talked about. The way that this one looks also kind of bears a resemblance to the last car, and now that I'm looking at it, it kind of looks like a DeLorean. But yeah, with this vehicle, they really went hard on optimizing performance and somehow ended up getting a 70 to 120 mile range. There is a 50-mile difference there, so I'm not too sure what the range would have realistically been, but even if it was on the low end of 70 miles, that would have been pretty impressive. The top speed was also wild at 65 miles per hour and a 9-second 0 to 30 time. Yeah, I hadn't heard of 0 to 30 times before writing this list, but that was the standard before everything could break 100 miles per hour damn near. If you're wondering how this thing pushed the stats up so far, while the Garrett NASA vehicle still was in the 30-mile range territory, it's because while the Garrett NASA was focused on advancing the technology with innovations like the flywheel, the ETV1 prioritized range and usable road performance, which allowed them to push to the limit of what the EV could do with the current tech. But with no crucial breakthroughs in battery tech and energy density, this car was still doomed to be forever a prototype, despite having some of the best specs that we've seen so far. Here we are in the last era from the 80s to the 90s, and this is where all the pieces are going to be set into place that will make it so that a little startup in California will eventually break through and create the first true mass production electric car. For context, at this point in the timeline, gas prices are not much of a concern, and actually the opposite of that. There ends up being huge credits given to consumers purchasing SUVs, and cars like the gas-guzzling Hummer were becoming popular. The main concern in this era is the climate and the effects of global warming. So, with all signs pointing towards inevitable electrification, let's start our journey with the Curb-Watt. This car was another attempt at creating a delivery EV, and this time it was meant for USPS to replace the Jeep DJ they were using at the time. Converting the entire mail fleet to electric would have saved them nearly 500,000 gallons of fuel that they used each year to power their fleet. And yes, this was developed by Grumman, who would later merge with another company to become Northrop Grumman and develop the B-2 bomber. As we are still in 1980, this was also developed to help with the oil crisis like many of the other vehicles we saw in the 70s. About 50 of these vehicles ended up being made, and 40 of them went to USPS, and the other 10 were sold to private buyers and utility companies. They were used by USPS in places like Indiana and California for around 10 years when the program was discontinued in the 90s because the batteries were still quite expensive and oil prices stabilized. That's the end of this vehicle story, but Grumman actually ended up winning the contract to produce the next generation delivery vans for USPS. They made the Lifelong Vehicle, or LLV, which is the quirky little mail car that they still use today. The Electrek, aka the Electrek Uncar, was developed by a small Colorado company known as Unique Mobility Inc. And unique this car was with these oversized windows and generally odd shape, making this thing stand out on the roads of 1982. That is, if you actually ended up seeing one, because there was only 35 to 75 units made in total, at a price of $25,000, which would have been $80,000 today. One strange detail about this car was the placement of the battery pack, which was right in the center console, making it extremely oversized and pushing the passenger and driver to the very edge of the right and left side. Another strange quirk was the defroster, which was actually just a Gillette hairdryer set to max heat. Hey, if it works, it works. They didn't have the advanced wind tunnel simulations that we have now, so what they actually did at the time was put yarn all over the car and drive it to get their measurements. It seemed to work somehow, and this has a drag coefficient of 0.30, which was pretty much better than any production car at the time. The way you'd charge this was actually just with your standard household outlet, which is hard to imagine in our time of superchargers. It would have taken about 10 to 12 hours to get a full charge, and there was some concept of hot swappable battery packs to help with this, but it was never fully implemented. If you're interested in this, I actually found most of this info from a guy out in Colorado named Declan, who's preserving and working on these relics. Definitely give him a look, as he's working on some other vehicles that we've covered so far, like the city car. So, the Whisper W1 from 1983. This one's definitely one of those super obscure cars, but I had to include it in the list because just look at that face. Why does it look so subtly concerned, like, gee, I don't know about this one, Rick, or something like that? Jokes aside though, this was an EV developed in Denmark with the straightforward goal of being a compact, 4-seater, efficient urban vehicle. The top speed was 37 miles per hour and the range was around 62 miles on a full charge. So pretty meh, to be honest. Definitely not going to start an electric revolution anytime soon, but it is what it is. Probably the most memorable thing about this vehicle was its unveiling in Copenhagen, where the driver actually ended up falling asleep and rolled away hitting a barrier. There's even a video of this out there where you can see the guy trying to put the bumper back in place and it just falls completely off. And the other guy's like, shit, I'm definitely not making my money back on this one. So yeah, just a quirky car from 1983 with a cute design and a horrible unveiling, but nothing too crazy beyond that. Now this one is definitely a bit of a stretch for an electric vehicle retrospective, but the story is too interesting not to include. The Sinclair C5 was made by Sir Clive Sinclair, who was a very successful inventor from the UK. He made things like calculators, computers, and even something called a microvision, which was basically a pocket-sized television, and apparently would only work if conditions were perfect. It's interesting though, because if you ever wondered what a smartphone would look like in 1985, that's basically it. So, feeling confident from some of these successes, Sinclair thought it would be a good idea to revolutionize transport, and ended up creating the C5, which is technically categorized as an electrically assisted pedal cycle. The hype around these was crazy, with Sinclair saying that this would truly be a revolutionary product, and you would end up seeing a ton of these out on the road. Unfortunately, this couldn't have been farther from the truth, and the product completely flopped, with the company going bankrupt soon after. So what were the issues? Well, for one, this was marketed as being able to drive on the roads next to other cars, but in reality, you would only do this if you had a death wish. You were so low to the ground that the other cars could barely see you. And there was no seatbelts, airbags, or anything really that would prevent you from becoming roadkill if there was ever an accident. This was one of the key flaws, is that they were basically trying to shoot for the middle ground of a bicycle and a car, mixing the perks of a bicycle, like not needing a license, with the perks of a car, like being able to go on the road, and in the end, they didn't really appeal to any of these markets. You add on to all that the specs were completely trashed, with a 15-mile range and a 15-mile-per-hour top speed. Yeah, you thought the micro EVs had it worse, but the C5 literally needed bicycle pedals because you would probably end up running out of charge if you ever plan on using this for more than an hour. And the cherry on top of all this is that there wasn't any weather protection. So, if it ever happened to rain out there in the UK, like it tends to do sometimes, your $1,000 pedal-assisted EV was basically destroyed. Even though everything about this EV is basically a disaster, you have to give it to Sinclair for having the audacity to attempt such a strange vehicle. And who knows, maybe in another universe they got it right and everyone's riding around in the C5, but unfortunately this is not that universe. I bet you've never seen this thing before, at least I hadn't until I went deeper into this topic, but this is the Sun Racer from GM in collaboration with AeroVironment. AeroVironment was started by Paul McCready, who made the Gossamer Kondo, which was a super lightweight and aerodynamic flyer that is powered by the human muscle. So, he used what he learned with that extremely efficient project and helped GM create the Sun Racer. If you couldn't tell, this was definitely no typical passenger vehicle and was actually a solar-powered racer, and that's solar-powered as in completely solar-powered, with the only batteries being used to buffer the solar energy it would receive. And one of the craziest parts is that there was actually someone in this thing while it was racing. This was created for the first World Solar Challenge event, which was being held across 1,950 miles of the Australian outback. The point of this event was to have different companies create racers powered completely by solar energy and send them off into the outback to see who made the best design. Out of 23 teams, the Sun Racer won by a landslide with an average speed of 41.6 miles and passed the finish line nearly 2 full days ahead of the next racer. It also clocked a top speed of 68 miles per hour, which is quite crazy when you consider that most of the cars that we've talked about haven't even been able to crack 60 miles per hour. This vehicle was completely designed for efficiency though, with no need for all the features you'd need in a typical vehicle, but the fact that this works so well ended up laying the groundwork for a future EV project by GM that we'll be discussing soon. When it comes to the design of this vehicle, it was made as a teardrop shape to give it the absolute best aerodynamics possible. This foreshadows the near future where aerodynamics will be a key spec for EVs, using it to eke out as much range as possible. The body had 8,800 solar cells with silver zinc batteries to buffer the energy and provide additional power during acceleration and hill climbs. The vehicle body was made from Kevlar composites over an ultra-light aluminum space frame, which kept the weight as low as it could possibly be. And if you're wondering what a space frame is, like I was, it's basically a vehicle skeleton made of small tubes that are arranged in triangles. The tubes are for weight reduction and the triangles are to give it strength. But yeah, this World Solar Challenge actually became a yearly event after 1987 and still goes on today to help the innovation and furtherance of solar-powered vehicles. If you guys want me to do a video about these vehicles, let me know because some of these designs are actually insane. If you were thinking, man, if only the Sinclair C5 had an enclosed roof, it would have been amazing. Well, that exact thing happened in 1987 with another company making the Mini L. It's funny, when I look at this car, it reminds me of the night bus scene in Harry Potter where the car gets really narrow. I can't imagine the places you'd be able to fit in with this car. You'd definitely be able to do that motorcycle hack where they go in between the lanes when, the freeway is all congested and stuff. But yeah, this car was able to fit 2 people. Nah, I'm just playing. This was definitely a single-seater kind of setup. But I think if you're willing to risk it whipping this thing around, you should be the only one to face the consequences. They were actually smart with this one though, and didn't make it some strange bike-car hybrid, but went with what was possible with the micro EV kind of setup. It had 3 wheels with 1 in the front and 2 in the back, and could push it to around 25 miles per hour at the highest with a range of about 34 miles. So honestly, what you'd expect for something that looks like this. There wasn't any typical doors either, with the whole cockpit actually opening up to allow entry. The price was actually pretty good for what you were getting at about 27,450 Danish kroner, where a standard new small car at the time would have cost around 253,000 Danish kroner, or about 10 times more. And if you aren't able to convert Danish kroner to American dollars like I can, then 27,450 kroner is about equal to $4,000 in 1987, which would have been about $11,500 today. So yeah, I think that price actually makes sense for what you'd be getting at the time. Unfortunately, there isn't any official records of how many of these sold because the design and production changed through different companies over the years. But from what I've researched, there were thousands made, and even though this was always a niche product, it actually ended up lasting to 2018 with pretty much the exact same design under the name City L. Although I can't find any pictures of the City L past 1997, so this info might be wrong, but even making it to 1997 is a pretty big accomplishment for EVs. The GM Impact. With the name like that, they were definitely tempting fate, but it does sound kinda sick. This concept car was developed from what they learned with the Sun Racer experiment, and is actually the most impressive EV we've seen so far with a top speed of 105 miles per hour and a 0 to 60 of 8 seconds. If you're thinking the range must have sucked with a top speed like that, you'd actually be wrong. This thing had a range of 120 to 125 miles while using lead acid batteries, although there is an asterisk that this is under ideal conditions. This vehicle was actually so impressive that it ended up being the reason California passed its emissions mandate, pressuring the major automakers to produce zero-emission vehicles or risk not being able to sell cars in California, period. So GM kind of ended up shooting themselves in the foot with this one, but we'll discuss the mandate drama later. This was only a concept car, but directly led to one of the most famous EVs ever made before Tesla ended up taking the crown years later. Volvo is our next player in the history of the EV, and they created the ECC, or Environmental Concept Car, in 1992. And they used the word environmental not just because it was an electric car, but also because they wanted to have a high recyclability for the body and components. The specs were actually really great, just like the Impact, with a top speed of 109 miles per hour and a range of around 90 miles. The range could also technically go up to 415 miles with the gas turbine engine that acted as a generator. If you noticed, I said turbine engine and not piston engine, which is usually what's typical of hybrids. The turbine engine worked by compressing air to high pressure when gas is injected and ignited, causing the turbine to spin and drive the generator. Definitely an interesting way to make the system work, but typical piston engines would end up being the main way hybrids would work in the future. So yeah, not too much else to say about this one other than the fact that the design ended up being the blueprint for a lot of future Volvo cars with the sleek kind of aerodynamic look as opposed to the boxy cars they used to make. This one has a really simple look that I love. It feels perfectly subtle. The GM Ev1. I've been looking forward to talking about this car because it's really an interesting story. But first, let's take a second to marvel at this thing. Some may say it's ugly as shit, and it definitely took me a while to appreciate the wheel covers they have on the rear wheels, but once you get used to it and look at this from more of a historical perspective, I honestly think it's exactly what a true production level EV should look like about to enter the 21st century. And in an alternate universe, this would have been the start of something incredible for GM, but as we'll soon come to find out, it wasn't, and there's no one to blame but GM. If you're thinking that we just saw this car, you'd be pretty much right, because this is what the Impact actually ended up becoming. And the stats are almost identical to the Impact, but are definitely lower than that because that was a concept car and this is the production version. It had a top speed of 80 miles per hour and a range of 70 to 100 miles, with later versions being made with nickel metal hydride batteries instead of the lead acid batteries, bumping the range up to 100 to 160 miles. They ended up making a little over 1,000 of these from 1996 to 1999. So, hallelujah, right? Everything here seems to indicate that the production EV has finally been created and we can all sleep soundly knowing that there won't be inevitable climate disaster in the near future. Right? Well, no. There was never an EV2 or even an EV3. The program started and stopped with the EV1. But why? Well, let me explain. All the cars were leased because that's the only way that GM would let you have them, and they were all pretty much in California with some in Arizona. GM did this so that they can keep control over the program and prevent any reverse engineering that could leak the proprietary technology that they had invented. The tech was also so new that they wanted to limit their legal exposure if there was ever any battery failures or things of that nature. There was some other reasons for the leasing, but overall this seems pretty honest, and I wouldn't say it was for malicious reasons. Yet, since all the cars were leased, once the lease was over around 2003 and 2004, instead of allowing renewals, they actually ended up recalling all the vehicles and actually crushing them all, and with that, crushing the electric vehicle dream, at least for a couple years. GM said that there was low demand and the economics still didn't make sense. That last part might have been true, but this was also around the time that legislation was weakened for the zero emissions mandate in California, putting way less pressure on GM to produce the EV1s. Also, the claim that there wasn't enough demand for electric vehicles is hard to believe when you realize that the people who were leasing the EV1s actually protested their taking of them and begged GM to at least buy the car flat out because they absolutely loved them so much. There's amazing documentation of all this in the movie Who Killed the Electric Car, where people who had the leases actually held a funeral for the EV1 and spoke words of mourning for their beloved car. But yeah, when you look at the big picture, it seems that GM, as well as other car manufacturers, did not want to transition their fleet to electric because they made huge money on all the aftermarket parts that people bought for their combustion vehicles. The oil industry also had a huge stake in this, being that their entire business would go under if the world was run on electricity rather than gas. It is nice though because we still ended up making it to the good ending where another company ended up taking this torch of electrification and brought it to the finish line. And honestly, I think if GM ended up continuing its program, making EVs, they would be a lot more boring than the Teslas we have today, so I think all's well that ends well. The AC Propulsion Tzero, a badass name for a badass car, and the Tzero might as well stand for Tesla Zero because this is the direct predecessor to the Tesla Roadster. First off, let's just admire the look of this thing. Absolutely one of the most special cars I've ever bore witness to, and I think one of the aspects that jumps out the most is that completely smooth front where you normally have a grille. It literally looks completely soft, like the body's made out of some other material than what it really is. And the expression the headlights are giving, like some Thanos I am inevitable shit, it's amazing. So yeah, hats off to the design of the body, but what was this thing capable of? It originally ran on lead acid batteries, and with their AC 150 electric drivetrain and other innovations, they managed to get a crazy 100-mile range and a top speed of around 95 miles an hour. So these specs are already the best we've ever seen, but eventually they switched out the lead acid for lithium-ion batteries, and the range and performance were drastically improved. The range ended up getting bumped to an estimated 300 plus miles, and the top speed ended up reaching 140 miles per hour if you did proper gearing. The 0 to 60 was also insane at around 3.6 seconds. This puts it above ICE cars at the time, like the Porsche 911 Turbo or the Ferrari 360 Medina, at least in 0 to 60 time, because if you're doing a long sustained race, the ICE cars still win eventually. So yeah, extremely impressive, but the hardest part was yet to come since they only made 3 of these cars and they were all pretty much hand built. So the next step would be to actually get a production line and start mass manufacturing. But AC Propulsion did not want to do this at the time, and a man named Elon Musk eventually came to the table requesting to commercialize the Tzero concept. AC Propulsion told him that another team consisting of Martin Eberhard and Mark Tarpenning also wanted to commercialize the Tzero, and he should join forces with them. This is the start of Tesla as we know it, although according to Musk, the Roadster ended up basically using none of the Tzero systems in the end, but it was still thanks to this car for providing the proof that something like this was possible. So yes, that is 40 EVs over about 100 years of history, and wow, did this take longer than I was thinking. I honestly didn't even know how many notable EVs had been made starting this, and the further I went, the more cars I found, so hopefully I covered everything notable, but if I missed anything, definitely let me know in the comments. Well, thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you next time. Peace.